He wasn't supposed to hear it again. Not that sound. Not after all these years. It came thin and fragile through the storm, barely louder than the rain tapping against the windshield, a broken cry that seemed to rise from the earth itself and vanish just as quickly. Daniel Hayes tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles paling as the wipers dragged slow arcs across the glass, pushing aside sheets of cold November rain. The road ahead stretched empty for miles, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through dark woods that smelled of pine and wet soil, the kind of road no one drove unless they had somewhere they didn't want to think about. His headlights carved tunnels through the downpour, catching glimpses of soaked branches swaying like shadows that couldn't decide whether to stay or disappear. He exhaled slowly, steady but heavy, the kind of breath that carried weight you couldn't see. Around his neck, tucked beneath his jacket, a pair of worn dog tags rested against his chest, cool and familiar, tapping softly with each movement, a quiet reminder of a promise he once made and never quite kept. The rain grew harder, drumming against the roof in uneven rhythms, and for a moment, it almost drowned everything else out. Almost. Then it came again. A faint cry, so small it could have been imagined, so familiar it made his chest tighten before his mind could catch up. Daniel froze, his foot easing off the gas as the truck rolled slower along the slick road. No, he muttered under his breath, not in fear, but in disbelief, as if saying it aloud might undo what he had just heard. The sound slipped through the storm once more, fragile and desperate, threading through the rain like something that refused to be silenced. His pulse shifted, steady to sharp, and something deep inside him stirred, something he had spent years trying to bury beneath routine, beneath distance, beneath silence. The kind of memory that doesn't fade, only waits. He glanced at the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something behind him, but there was only darkness, endless and empty. The road ahead didn't change. The storm didn't ease. But that sound had stayed, and it pulled at him, quiet but relentless, like a hand reaching through time. Daniel slowed the truck to a crawl, eyes scanning the edges of the road where water pooled and spilled into shallow ditches, where anything small enough could be swallowed without a trace. "You're hearing things," he said to himself, but the words lacked conviction, dissolving almost as soon as they left his mouth. Because somewhere beneath the rain, beneath the wind, beneath everything he told himself to ignore, something was still calling out. And this time he couldn't drive past it. Daniel eased the truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching softly beneath the tires as the engine idled low and steady, a mechanical heartbeat against the chaos of the storm. And for a moment he just sat there, hands still on the wheel, listening, really listening, the rain hammering the roof, the wind pushing against the frame, and beneath it all that sound again, faint but stubborn, like something too small to survive, yet too determined to disappear, and it pulled at him in a way he could not explain, not with logic, not with reason, only with something older, something that remembered nights that smelled just like this one. Wet earth and cold air, and the quiet tension of waiting for something you could not see but knew was there, and his jaw tightened as he reached for the door handle, hesitating for half a second, as if stepping out would confirm what he already feared. Then he pushed it open, and the rain came in sideways, sharp and cold against his face, soaking through his jacket. Within seconds, as his boots hit the ground and sank slightly into the soft shoulder, water pooling around the edges of the road and spilling into the ditch beyond, the headlights stretching just far enough to reveal uneven ground, scattered debris, and the dark mouth of a drainage culvert half hidden beneath tangled grass and mud. And that was where the sound came from, thinner now, weaker, but still there. And Daniel felt something in his chest shift, a quiet urgency that did not shout, but did not let go either. And he moved forward slowly at first, then faster, rain dripping from his brow into his eyes as he wiped it away with the back of his hand. "Hey," he called out, his voice low but steady, not expecting an answer, not really, but needing to fill the silence anyway. And when he reached the edge of the ditch, he crouched down, the cold seeping through his jeans as water soaked the fabric. And he leaned closer, peering into the narrow opening where the culvert disappeared beneath the road, darkness swallowing most of it except for the faintest glimmer of reflected light. And then he saw it, small, barely more than a shadow, pressed against the concrete, trembling, a pair of eyes catching the beam for just a second before blinking slowly, as if even that took effort. And Daniel exhaled. Not relief, not yet, something closer to recognition, like finding a piece of a memory that had been missing all along. Easy, he murmured, softer now, his voice dropping instinctively into the tone he had used years ago in places far louder and far more dangerous than this quiet stretch of road. And he slid one hand forward, careful, deliberate, testing the space, the water cold and fast around his fingers as it rushed past, carrying leaves and small debris. The current stronger than it looked, and he paused, measuring it, feeling the pull, knowing that one wrong move could push something small deeper into the darkness where he could not reach. And his other hand instinctively rose to his chest, brushing against the dog tags beneath his jacket, the metal cool and steady. And for a brief second the world narrowed to that contact, that weight, that memory, and his eyes closed just long enough to feel it before opening again with something firmer behind them, something decided. Not this time. He whispered not to the storm, not to the road, but to something only he could hear, and then he leaned in further, committing to the reach, to the moment, to whatever waited just beyond the edge of the light. The water pressed harder against his hand the deeper he reached, cold and insistent, slipping between his fingers as if trying to pull everything back into the dark. And Daniel adjusted his stance, boots shifting in the mud to find balance, his shoulder brushing against the wet grass as he leaned farther into the narrow opening, his breath slowing, steadying, the way it had been trained to do long before nights like this became quiet and empty instead of loud and dangerous. And for a moment, the only thing that mattered was the distance between his hand and that small trembling shape just beyond the reach of the light. Come on, he murmured, voice low and even, not commanding, not forcing, just there, present, the way you speak when you're asking something fragile to trust you without understanding why. And the puppy moved barely, a slight shift of weight, a weak attempt to pull back deeper into the culvert. Not out of fear exactly, but instinct, the kind that tells something small to hide when the world feels too big. And Daniel felt that hesitation like an echo inside his own chest, a memory of moments when retreat felt safer than reaching out, when silence felt easier than asking for help, and his fingers brushed against wet fur, thin and soaked, the contact so slight it could have been imagined. But it was enough to stop the retreat, enough to anchor the moment. And he held there, not grabbing, not rushing, just letting the touch exist, letting the puppy feel that he was not another force pushing it further into the dark. And the rain softened for a second, or maybe it only felt that way, the sound shifting just enough for him to hear a faint, uneven breath, shallow but there, and his jaw tightened as something in his chest eased and tightened at the same time. That is it. You are okay, he said quietly, the words more for himself than anything else, and slowly, carefully, he slid his hand farther under the small body, feeling the fragile weight, the tremble that ran through it like a current. And he lifted just enough to test, the water tugging at his sleeve, the space too narrow for anything sudden, and he adjusted again, angling his arm, guiding rather than pulling, inch by inch, until the shape began to move with him instead of against him. And when the puppy finally slipped free of the tight space, it happened so gently it almost felt unreal, one moment hidden, the next cradled against his forearm, small and shivering, its head resting weakly against his wrist, as if it had simply run out of strength to resist anything at all. And Daniel drew back, slowly, careful not to lose footing, careful not to let the moment break, until he was kneeling fully in the rain again, the culvert behind him, the storm still falling, but somehow quieter now, and he looked down at the small creature in his arms. Its fur darkened by water, its body light, too light, and its eyes half open, unfocused but still searching, and for a long second he just stayed there, the rain running down his face, mixing with something warmer he did not bother to wipe away, and the dog tags at his chest shifted as he breathed, tapping softly once, and the puppy stirred just enough to nuzzle against that faint sound, as if recognizing something it could not name. And Daniel swallowed. his voice barely above the rain when he spoke again. "I have got you now." And this time he believed it. Daniel stood slowly, the weight of the small body in his arms almost nothing and yet impossibly heavy at the same time, as if it carried more than just fragile bones and soaked fur, as if it carried a moment that could not be undone. And the rain continued to fall, steady and unrelenting, tracing cold lines down his neck and into his collar, but he barely noticed it now, his focus narrowing to the faint rise and fall beneath his hand. Uneven, shallow, but there, and he adjusted his grip. Instinctively, tucking the puppy closer against his chest beneath the shelter of his jacket, trying to share what little warmth he had left. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice quieter now, almost swallowed by the storm, and the words came without thought, the same words he had spoken once before in a different place, under a different sky, where the rain had smelled like dust and smoke instead of pine and asphalt. And for a second his jaw tightened as the memory brushed too close, but he pushed it back. Not now. Not here, because this moment demanded everything he had, and nothing less. And he turned toward the truck, boots slipping slightly on the wet gravel before finding steadiness again, each step careful, deliberate, the way you move when what you carry cannot be dropped, cannot be risked. And when he reached the door, he shifted the puppy gently with one arm, pulling it open and climbing inside quickly, shutting out the wind, but not the sound of the rain, which continued to drum against the roof like a distant echo, and the cab filled with the scent of wet fur and cold air, sharp and real, grounding him in the present. And he sat there for a moment, breathing, letting the quiet settle around them, the engine still idling, the heater beginning to push out a faint stream of warmth that felt almost fragile against the chill that clung to everything. And he looked down again, carefully brushing his thumb along the puppy's side, feeling for something steady, something certain, but the breathing remained light, uncertain, and his chest tightened, just enough to remind him how easily something like this could slip away if left alone. And he reached behind the seat with his free hand, grabbing an old blanket, worn and rough but dry, and he wrapped it around the small body, tucking the edges in with slow precision, creating a pocket of warmth, a barrier against the cold that had nearly taken everything. And as he did, the puppy shifted slightly, a weak movement, barely there, but enough to draw a quiet breath from him that he had not realized he was holding, and its head tilted just enough to rest against the inside of his wrist, closer now to the steady rhythm beneath his skin. And for a moment the two of them stayed like that, connected by something simple and wordless. And then Daniel felt it, a faint nudge against his chest, small but deliberate, and he glanced down to see the puppy's nose pressing lightly against the spot where his dog tags rested beneath the fabric, as if drawn to the subtle tap of metal against bone. And he froze, not in fear, but in recognition, the kind that did not make sense in words, only in feeling. And slowly, almost without thinking, he reached up and pulled the chain free from beneath his shirt, letting the tags fall into the space between them, dull silver catching the dim light, worn edges reflecting years of movement and memory. And the puppy's nose followed, pressing softly against them, lingering there as if finding something familiar in the scent, something that belonged. And Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on that small, quiet interaction. And the storm outside seemed to fade just enough to leave room for the silence inside the cab, a silence that did not feel empty, but full, as if something unseen had stepped into the space between past and present and bridged it without asking permission. And his voice, when it came again, was barely more than a breath. "Yeah, I know." And for the first time that night, the weight in his chest shifted, not gone, not healed, but lighter, just enough to keep going. The warmth inside the truck began to build slowly, almost imperceptibly, pushing back against the cold that clung to Daniel's clothes and skin, but he did not move yet, not fully, his attention still anchored to the small bundle in his hands, as if any sudden shift might undo the fragile balance they had found. And he adjusted the blanket again, careful, precise, tucking it closer around the puppy's body while keeping its head exposed, his fingers brushing lightly along the damp fur that was beginning to lose its icy stiffness. and he watched for signs, for anything that told him the fight was still there. And for a moment, there was nothing, just a faint rhythm of breath that came too shallow, too uncertain, and his jaw tightened as a quiet thought pressed in, the kind that does not shout but lingers at the edges, reminding him how quickly silence can take over if you wait too long. And he leaned closer, lowering his head just enough to feel the faint warmth of the puppy's breath against his wrist. And he stayed there, listening, counting without realizing it. One breath, then another, uneven, fragile, but still present. And he exhaled slowly, a measured release, as if matching that rhythm could somehow steady it. Stay with me. He repeated, softer now, not as a command, but as a promise. And his hand moved again, this time more deliberate, rubbing gently along the puppy's side in slow, steady motions, creating friction, warmth, life where the cold had nearly taken hold. And the movement seemed to stir something, a faint response, a slight tightening of the small body beneath the blanket, followed by the weakest shift of its head, barely more than a tremor, but enough to catch his breath. And he paused, not wanting to push too far, letting the moment settle before continuing, his touch careful, patient, the way you learn when rushing only makes things worse. And outside, the storm continued its steady rhythm. But inside the cab, something quieter was taking shape, something that did not need noise to exist. And then it happened, small, almost too small to notice. The puppy let out a faint sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a breath, something in between, fragile and raw. And Daniel's eyes lifted slightly, a flicker of something breaking through the weight he carried. That is it, come on, he murmured, his voice steady but softer now, edged with something that had not been there before. Hope, cautious and restrained, but real, and the puppy's chest rose again, a little deeper this time, not strong, not steady, but more than before, and its head shifted against his wrist, nudging faintly, toward the warmth, toward the steady beat beneath his skin, and his hand instinctively moved to support it, guiding without forcing, letting the small body find its place. And as it settled, its nose brushed once more against the dog tags resting between them, lingering there as if drawing strength from something unseen. And Daniel closed his eyes for just a second, not in exhaustion, but in recognition, in something that felt dangerously close to belief. And when he opened them again, his gaze was steadier, more grounded, as if the weight he carried had shifted just enough to let something else in. And he reached forward with his free hand, turning the heat up a notch, the vents pushing warmer air into the small space, filling it with a quiet promise of recovery. And he leaned back slightly, not to pull away, but to give the moment room to grow. And for the first time since the sound and the storm had stopped him on that road, he allowed himself to think beyond the next breath, beyond the next second, toward something else, something simple, something human. You are not staying out here tonight, he said quietly, more certain now, and the words settled into the space between them like a decision already made, like a line drawn against the cold. And the puppy, still weak, still trembling, shifted once more, pressing just a little closer, as if it understood. Daniel shifted the truck into gear, the engine responding with a low, steady hum as he eased back onto the road, headlights cutting once more through the rain that had begun to soften into a steady drizzle, less violent now, more like a lingering echo of the storm that had already passed its peak. And the tires rolled carefully over the wet asphalt, each turn deliberate, controlled, as if the world outside required less urgency than the fragile life inside the cab. And he kept one hand loosely on the wheel while the other remained close, resting against the small bundle wrapped in the blanket, fingers occasionally brushing the edge just to feel the subtle movement beneath it, a quiet reassurance that what he had pulled from the darkness was still holding on. And his gaze flicked down every few seconds, not out of doubt, but out of something closer to vigilance, the kind that does not relax until it knows for certain that the danger has passed. And the road stretched ahead in long, empty lines, bordered by trees that dripped with rainwater, their branches swaying gently now instead of thrashing, the air carrying that familiar scent of wet earth and cooling air that comes after a storm has spent itself. And inside the truck, the heater continued to push warmth into the space, slowly drying the edges of the blanket, slowly replacing the cold with something that felt almost safe, and Daniel adjusted the vent slightly, angling it toward the passenger seat, toward the small shape that had begun to shift more frequently, subtle movements, small signs of life returning inch by inch. And he noticed it, the way the puppy's breathing had deepened just enough to be heard without leaning close, the way its head turned faintly as if reacting to the warmth, to the steady rhythm of the engine, to the quiet presence beside it, and something in his chest loosened. Not fully, not completely, but enough to let a breath come easier than before, and he glanced down again, just for a second, catching the faintest flicker of movement as the puppy's eyes opened slightly, unfocused, blinking against the dim light of the dashboard. And he felt it then, a shift, small but undeniable, like watching something cross the line between fading and staying, and his voice came out softer than he expected, almost careful. "Hey, you are still with me." And the words hung in the air, simple, unadorned, but filled with more meaning than he could explain, and the puppy made a faint sound in response, barely audible, a soft exhale that seemed to carry effort with it, and its nose lifted just slightly, searching before settling again against the warmth of the blanket, closer to the faint metallic tap of the dog tags that rested against Daniel's chest. And he felt that connection again, that quiet, unspoken thread that had formed somewhere between the storm and this moment. And he did not question it, did not try to define it, because some things did not need names to be real, and the road curved gently ahead, leading toward a distant set of lights barely visible through the thinning rain, the promise of somewhere warmer, somewhere safer, and Daniel adjusted his grip on the wheel, his posture easing just slightly as the tension that had held him tight since the first sound in the storm began to release, not disappearing, but changing, shifting into something steadier, something that could carry forward instead of holding him back. And for the first time in a long while, the silence inside the truck did not feel heavy, did not press down on him with memories he could not escape. Instead, it settled around them like a quiet space where something new could exist, something fragile, something unfinished, but real all the same. And as the truck moved steadily toward those distant lights, Daniel allowed himself a thought he had not entertained in a long time. Not fully, not without hesitation, but enough to feel it take shape. Maybe some things were not meant to be left behind in the storm. Maybe some things found their way back, not to replace what was lost, but to remind you that you were still here, still moving, still capable of holding on. And he glanced down one more time, his hand resting lightly against the blanket as the small body beneath it shifted closer, and he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if answering something only he could hear. "We are getting there." The glow of the roadside clinic came into view through the thinning rain, soft yellow lights spilling across the wet pavement like a quiet invitation, and Daniel slowed the truck as he pulled into the small gravel lot, the tires crunching gently beneath him before coming to a stop. And for a moment he did not move, his hands resting loosely on the wheel as he looked toward the front door, the faint outline of a sign swaying slightly in the damp breeze, its edges tapping softly against the metal frame. And the world outside felt calmer now, the storm reduced to a steady drizzle, the air carrying that clean, cooled scent that follows after something has broken and passed. And he exhaled slowly, a breath that felt deeper than the ones before, as if something inside him had shifted just enough to allow it. And then he reached over, his hand moving carefully to the blanket, fingers brushing along its edge before lifting it slightly to check. And the puppy stirred again, more noticeably this time, its small head shifting weakly as its eyes opened a fraction wider, unfocused but present. And Daniel felt a quiet pull in his chest, something steady, something grounding, and he nodded once, almost to himself, before opening the door and stepping out into the cool air, the drizzle tapping lightly against his jacket as he moved around to the passenger side, opening the door with the same careful precision he had carried since the moment he first heard that fragile cry. And he gathered the small bundle into his arms again, holding it close, protecting it from the lingering cold as he turned toward the clinic, his boots pressing into the damp gravel with each step, steady, deliberate. And when he pushed the door open, a soft chime echoed through the quiet interior, warm air meeting him immediately. carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and something gentler beneath it, something that spoke of care, of healing, of quiet places where things were given a second chance. And a woman behind the counter looked up, her expression shifting from routine to concern as her eyes landed on the small shape in his arms, and Daniel did not say much at first, only stepped forward, placing the bundle gently on the counter as his hand lingered there, not quite ready to let go. "Found him out on the road," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. And the woman moved quickly but gently, pulling the blanket back just enough to assess, her hands practiced, careful, and Daniel stepped back half a pace, not out of detachment, but out of trust, watching closely as she worked, and the puppy let out a faint sound again, a soft, fragile noise that seemed stronger than before, and he felt it, that subtle shift, that quiet confirmation that the fight was still there. And as the woman lifted the puppy slightly, preparing to carry it toward the back, Daniel's dog tags slipped forward again, catching the light for just a second, and the puppy's nose moved instinctively toward them once more, lingering there in that small, inexplicable connection. And Daniel's gaze softened, his hand lifting unconsciously as if to steady both the chain and the moment. And then the woman gave him a reassuring nod before disappearing through the door, leaving him standing there in the quiet front room. The sound of rain faint against the windows, the warmth settling around him. And for the first time since the night began, he felt the stillness not as something heavy, but as something earned, something that held meaning. And he let his hand fall back to his side slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly as he stood there, listening, waiting, and somewhere in that quiet, something inside him began to settle. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to feel the difference, enough to know that something had changed, even if he could not yet explain how. Time moved differently inside that quiet room, measured not by clocks, but by the soft sounds that drifted from beyond the closed door, the faint clink of metal instruments, the low murmur of voices kept intentionally calm, and Daniel stood there with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes fixed on that door, as if watching it closely could somehow influence what was happening on the other side. And the warmth of the clinic had begun to settle into him now, drying the edges of his jacket, easing the tension in his shoulders, but there was still a part of him that remained on that road, in that moment when the storm had not yet passed and the outcome had not yet been decided. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a second before drifting back up, his thoughts moving quietly, not racing, not overwhelming, just present. And for the first time in a long while, they did not pull him backward, did not drag him into memories he could not change. Instead, they hovered here, anchored to something that had happened, something he had done, something that had not slipped through his hands, and his fingers brushed lightly against the dog tags at his chest again, the metal still faintly warm now from the heat inside, and he held them there for a moment, feeling their weight, not as a burden this time, but as something steady, something that connected past and present without tearing him between them. And the door opened softly then, pulling him back, and the woman stepped out, her expression gentler now, less urgent, as she offered him a small, reassuring smile that said more than words needed to. "He is stable," she said quietly, her voice calm and certain, and Daniel felt something in his chest release. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to let his shoulders drop just slightly, enough to let a breath come out that he had been holding since the moment he first leaned into that culvert. And he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, but his eyes remained steady, searching for more, and she continued, explaining in measured tones that the puppy was cold, exhausted, but strong, stronger than it had any right to be given the conditions, and that with warmth, care, and time, it had a real chance. And Daniel listened without interrupting, taking in each word as if it mattered more than anything else in that moment, because it did. And when she finished, there was a pause, a quiet space where nothing needed to be said, and he glanced toward the door again, then back to her. "Can I see him?" he asked, his voice low, respectful, not demanding, and she nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. And as he moved through the doorway, the air shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of clean linens and something softer, something alive, and he stepped into the small treatment room where the puppy lay wrapped now in fresh blankets, dry and carefully arranged, a small heat lamp casting a gentle glow over the space. And for a moment Daniel stopped just inside the doorway, taking it in, the stillness, the quiet rise and fall of that small chest, steadier now, more certain, and he moved closer slowly, his steps light, almost instinctively careful, as if he did not want to disturb what had been rebuilt. And when he reached the side of the table, he rested his hand lightly against the edge, not touching yet, just there, present, and the puppy stirred faintly, its head shifting just enough for its nose to catch something familiar. And Daniel saw it, the subtle recognition, the way it leaned ever so slightly toward him, and his hand lifted then, moving gently to rest against the blanket, fingers brushing softly along the side. And for a moment the world narrowed again, not to urgency, not to fear, but to something quieter, something steadier, a connection that did not need explanation. And he stood there, breathing evenly, his voice barely above a whisper when it finally came. You made it, and this time it felt like more than hope, it felt like truth. Morning arrived quietly, not with sunlight bursting through the windows, but with a soft gray glow that settled gently over the clinic, the kind of light that feels like a promise rather than a demand. And Daniel had not realized how long he had been sitting there until he noticed the change, the way the shadows had softened, the way the world outside had shifted from night into something calmer, something steadier. And he leaned back slightly in the chair beside the small treatment table, his eyes still fixed on the puppy, who now lay more peacefully beneath the warmth of the lamp, its breathing even, its body no longer trembling. And for a moment he just watched, taking in the simple rhythm of it, the rise and fall that meant everything had not been lost, that something fragile had held on long enough to be found. And his hand rested loosely against the edge of the table, close enough to feel connected, far enough to let the moment belong to the quiet itself and the dog tags at. His chest shifted faintly as he moved, catching the soft light of morning, their surface worn but steady, and he reached up unconsciously, letting his fingers curl around them, not gripping tightly, just holding, acknowledging, and his gaze drifted for a second, not away from the present but through it, as if seeing two moments at once, one that had slipped away in a storm long ago, and one that had stayed, that had answered, that had returned in a form he never expected. And he exhaled slowly, the breath carrying something different now, not the weight of what he could not change, but the quiet acceptance of what had been given back. And the puppy stirred then, a small movement that drew his attention immediately, its eyes opening a little wider this time, clearer, more focused, and for a second it simply looked, not searching, not afraid, just present. And then its head shifted slightly, leaning toward the faint sound of metal as the dog tags tapped once against his chest, and Daniel felt a small, almost imperceptible smile form. Not forced, not practiced, but real, the kind that comes when something inside finally loosens its grip, and he leaned forward just a little, his hand moving gently to rest against the blanket, his voice low and steady. You found your way, did you not? And the puppy responded with the faintest movement, pressing its nose lightly against his fingers, a simple gesture, small and quiet, but filled with something that did not need words. And in that moment the room felt different, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because something had settled into place, something that had been missing without him realizing it. And he sat there for a while longer, not rushing, not needing to move, letting the silence exist as it was, full instead of empty. And when he finally stood, it was with a sense of calm that had not been there before, a steadiness that did not come from forgetting, but from carrying something new alongside what had always been there. And he glanced once more at the small figure resting beneath the light, then down at the dog tags in his hand. And for a second, he simply held both moments together, past and present, loss and return, and he nodded quietly, not as a conclusion, not as an ending, but as an understanding, something simple and unspoken. And as he turned toward the door, the soft morning light following him out, it felt less like leaving something behind and more like carrying it forward. And somewhere in that quiet space between steps, a truth settled in, gentle and certain, some miracles do not change the past. They change the way we walk with it. In this deeply moving cinematic journey, a U.S. Marine driving through a cold rainstorm hears a faint cry that changes everything, leading him to discover a fragile German shepherd puppy struggling to survive in a flooded roadside culvert. What follows is one of those unforgettable animal stories where instinct, memory, and quiet courage collide. As the Marine chooses not to walk away and instead risks the storm to reach a life that refuses to give up, through careful hands, warmth, and unwavering presence, the tiny creature begins to respond, marking the start of a transformation that feels almost like grace unfolding in real time. As they travel together through the fading storm towards safety, the bond between a battle-worn Marine and a vulnerable puppy grows in silence, shaped not by words, but by shared survival, making this one of the most heartfelt animal stories that captures the essence of loyalty and second chances. Inside a small rural clinic, under soft lights and steady care, the miracle continues quietly as the puppy stabilizes, responding not only to treatment, but to something deeper, a connection symbolized by the Marine's worn dog tags, echoing memories of a past that still lingers yet no longer defines him. This is where animal stories transcend simple rescue narratives and become reflections of healing, where saving another life becomes a path toward mending one's own unseen wounds. As morning arrives, calm and gentle, the fragile life that once trembled in the rain now breathes steadily, and the Marine, standing beside it, realizes that some encounters are not accidents, but answers, subtle and undeserved yet profoundly real, among the many animal stories that speak of hope and resilience. This one stands apart in its quiet honesty, showing how even the smallest act of compassion can shift the weight of the past, through stillness, warmth, and a bond formed in the storm. This story reminds us why animal stories continue to move hearts across generations, not because of grand gestures, but because of the simple truth that sometimes, in saving another, we are finally found ourselves. Character 1. A 35-year-old white U.S. Marine with rugged features, short dark brown hair, light stubble, wearing a wet military jacket and dog tags. Front-facing view, serious calm expression, realistic lighting, cinematic detail, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, natural skin texture, emotional depth. Character 2. A 3-month-old German shepherd puppy with sable black and tan coat. Full body visible, slightly wet fur, large paws, soft amber eyes, standing gently, realistic. Proportions, natural lighting, detailed texture, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, lifelike appearance, emotional presence.